The words, "Be kind," were painted in fading blue on the cracked wall near the bus stop, so old that most people walked past them without noticing. I had seen them every morning for years, yet that day they seemed to look back at me, as if asking a question I didn't have time to answer. My phone buzzed with unread messages, my mind raced with deadlines, and my heart felt heavier than it should have at 8 in the morning. Kindness felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. The bus arrived late, as usual. People climbed in with tired faces and guarded expressions, carrying invisible burdens that showed only in the way they avoided eye contact. I squeezed into a seat near the back. At the next stop, an elderly man stepped in slowly, leaning on a wooden cane polished smooth by years of use. No one moved. I looked at him, then looked away, telling myself someone else would stand. The bus lurched forward, and he struggled to keep his balance. Something inside me tightened. With an awkward rush, I stood up and offered my seat. He smiled, a gentle, grateful smile that softened his entire face. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm. It was such a small thing, barely an inconvenience, yet the relief on his face made it feel larger than the problems crowding my head. As I stood gripping the metal pole, I felt oddly lighter, as if I had put something down instead of given something away. That feeling stayed with me as I got off near my office. The security guard at the entrance, a man I passed every day without more than a nod, greeted me with a tired smile. This time, I stopped and asked how he was. He seemed surprised, then began talking about his daughter's school exams and his hope that she would become a teacher. It was a short conversation, but when I walked away, his smile looked less tired, and my steps felt steadiness I hadn't felt in weeks. The day, however, did not suddenly become easy. Meetings dragged on, emails piled up. And by afternoon I was back to feeling stretched thin. At lunch, I noticed a new colleague sitting alone, staring at her phone without really seeing it. I hesitated, then invited her to join me. She talked quietly about moving to the city, about missing home, about how lonely a crowded place could feel. I listened, not because I had perfect advice, but because listening itself felt like an act of kindness. When she thanked me for the company, I realized how rarely people thank others just for being present. On my way home that evening, rain began to fall, the sudden kind that turned streets into mirrors. Near the same bus stop with the faded words, I saw a woman struggling with grocery bags, her child tugging at her coat. Without thinking, I helped her carry them across the street. She laughed in relief, telling me how her husband was working late and how the rain always seemed to start at the worst moments. We parted ways, strangers again, but the sound of her laughter stayed with me longer than the rain. That night, as I lay in bed, the day replayed in my mind. None of the acts had been extraordinary. They wouldn't make headlines or change the world in obvious ways. Yet they had changed something in me. I realized that kindness was not a grand gesture reserved for better days, it was something that fit into ordinary moments, even on days when life felt heavy. The next morning, the world tested that realization. I spilled coffee on my shirt, missed the bus, and arrived late to work. Frustration simmered just beneath my skin. When a colleague snapped at me over a minor mistake, my first instinct was to snap back. I could feel the sharp words forming. Then, like a quiet interruption, the image of the faded words on the wall came to mind. "Be kind." I took a breath and responded calmly, offering to fix the issue. The tension eased. Later, the same colleague apologized, admitting he was under a lot of pressure at home. Kindness, I learned, could de-escalate storms before they became disasters. Weeks passed, and kindness began to shape my days in subtle ways. I started holding doors open, offering sincere compliments, sending messages to friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Not every act was acknowledged. Sometimes people were too distracted, too guarded, or too tired to respond. But that didn't seem to matter as much anymore. Kindness, I discovered, was not a transaction, it didn't require repayment. One evening, as I waited at the bus stop, I noticed the elderly man with the wooden cane again. He recognized me and waved. We talked during the ride. He told me about his wife, who had passed away years ago, and how he took the bus every Thursday to visit the park they used to walk through together. Some days are harder than others, he said softly. But small kindnesses make the journey easier. His words settled deep inside me, echoing long after we parted. Another day, I found myself on the other side of kindness. After a long, exhausting week, I stood in line at a crowded cafe, my patience worn thin. When it was my turn, I realized I had forgotten my wallet. Heat rushed to my face as I stepped aside, embarrassed. The woman behind me paid for my coffee without hesitation. "We all have those days," she said with a smile. I thanked her, feeling the familiar warmth spread through my chest. It was a reminder that kindness moves in circles, often returning when we least expect it. As months turned into a year, I began to see kindness not as something extra, but as something essential. It didn't erase pain or solve every problem, but it softened edges, created connections, and reminded people of their shared humanity. I noticed it in small places. A teacher staying late to help a struggling student, a neighbor leaving food at another's door, a stranger offering directions with patience instead of annoyance. One afternoon, I returned to the bus stop with the faded words. The wall had been repainted, the message almost gone beneath fresh layers of color. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of loss. Then I realized the words didn't need to be visible to exist. They lived in actions now, in choices made quietly every day. I thought back to who I had been before noticing that wall, before standing up on that bus. I was not unkind, but I was often too busy to be kind. I believed I had to wait for the right moment, the right mood, the right amount of energy. What I had learned was simpler and harder at the same time. Kindness begins the moment we decide to see others, even when we are tired, even when we are hurting. There were still days when I failed. Days when I was short-tempered, distracted, or withdrawn. But now, those moments felt like reminders rather than defeats. Each day offered countless chances to begin again. Kindness did not demand perfection, it asked only for intention. One rainy evening, much like the first, I helped another stranger across the street. As we reached the other side, the rain eased, and for a brief moment the city lights reflected in the puddles like stars. The stranger thanked me, and we went our separate ways. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, feeling something quiet and steady settle within me. I understood then that kindness is not about changing the whole world at once. It is about changing the part of the world we touch, moment by moment. It is about choosing compassion over convenience, patience over pride, and understanding over judgment. It is about recognizing that every person carries a story we cannot see, and that even the smallest gesture can be a turning point in that story. The words on the wall may fade, paint may peel, and days may grow heavy again. But kindness, once practiced, becomes a habit of the heart. It finds its way into voices, hands, and choices. And in a world that often feels rushed and divided, that simple choice, to be kind, remains one of the most powerful, inspirational, and motivational acts we can offer, not just to others, but to ourselves.